Welcome to the weekly discussions for the Blueprint Bible Study, hosted by the If Then Move team of Rebecca Lehman and Wendy Fitzgerald. Each week, we invite you to join us as we wrestle down and process through the big ideas of the study.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to week 3 of our Blueprint Bible Study. I'm here again with Rebecca.
Hello again.
And today we are jumping into the center of everything with our Bible study, where we are talking about Jesus as the blueprint for life. And so today, as we jump into that, I'm just going to right off the bat ask you, Rebecca, hey, will you go ahead and read that verse from Ephesians that kind of kicked off this whole idea for us?
Yeah, so in Ephesians chapter 1, we were reading this. Wendy and I have been reading through the New Testament for everyone together by N.T. Wright. And we had started Ephesians chapter 1. And in verses 9 and 10, he's talking about choosing us and the plan that he had for us. So I'm actually going to start in verse 7, and it says, "In the King and through his blood we have deliverance. That is, our sins have been forgiven through the wealth of his grace, which he lavished on us. Yes, with all wisdom and insight, he has made known to us the secret of his purpose, just as he wanted it to be, and set it forward in him as the blueprint for when the time was ripe. His plan was to sum up the whole cosmos in the King. Yes, everything in heaven and on earth in him."
Man, I love that description. Like, that's huge. So everything in the entire universe. Have you ever been to one of those, are they planetariums?
Yeah.
Where you lay back in the chair and you see how big the earth is and then how small the earth is. By the time you leave, you're like, oh my goodness, I'm so small and so small. Because it's just to even think of how big the Milky Way is, and then to realize that that's kind of small in comparison with how many other galaxies are out there. And then to realize that Jesus is the summation of all of that.
Yeah. It's hard to fathom. I think that's one of the reasons, though, that I like the beach so much. And I know that you're not a huge fan of the beach, so just bear with me on this one.
I'm learning to endure it.
Growing up, we would go to Daytona Beach often because we had family there. And I can just remember even sitting there thinking, there is someone on the other side of this ocean doing what I'm doing now. Or who comes and touches the other side of this, but they're on a completely different continent, like in multiple time zones away, like 7 hours away, the way that we count time. And somehow the moon helps control like the tides coming in and out on the beach. And it just makes me feel small, but it also, because I think it's nature is a piece of God's creation that makes me see him as big, and I think helps with my trust in the God of the universe, in my relationship with him. So I think maybe the beach has always meant something different to me than maybe it has to you.
Well, I live in Florida, and so as somebody who lived in Florida close to the beach, I've never been to the beach so much until you entered our world. So I'm very thankful for that. But I will tell you what you just said as far as like the largeness and the immensity and the vastness of the beach connecting you to the immensity of God is huge. One of my favorite examples that I've ever heard of the passage in John 15, which says, "You abide in me and I abide in you," is a picture from a beach. And basically somebody said, picture standing on the edge of the ocean, of the beach, and having a sand bucket, and taking that sand bucket and dipping it into the ocean. And that sand bucket represents you and the ocean represents God. And so you can be completely filled with him inside of the ocean and also be completely in him. So he is in you and you are in him at the same time. And if you're talking about that idea of being connected to God and this idea of him being so immense and everything being summed up in him, I think that's a great visual.
Yeah.
So anyway, well, this week and today, as we're kind of talking through things, we want to talk about just this idea of how Jesus was fully human and fully God. Like, he was the sand bucket and he was also the ocean at the same time. And so as we kind of talk through that idea of being fully God, and being fully human and how he was the center of all history, I think it's really important for us to understand the Bible is the recorded history of God and man. It's not a complete and entire history book of all of history, but it is a history book that complements and goes hand in hand with other historical documents. And what is recorded in that little library of 66 books and about 4,000 years of time or so is actually this journey of God and man together. And that's what we've been talking about in the Blueprint study. And in the Old Testament, we see about 4,000 years of human history with God laid out for us. We talked, I think, a little bit in the conference about how in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, 2,000 years of time expires. Through the rest of Genesis, another 500 years goes by. And then from the end of Genesis until the end of the Old Testament, in the book of Malachi, you see another 2,000 years or 1,500 years go by. So a total of about 4,000 years of recorded human history that we have documented in the Old Testament. And what we see in the Old Testament is every single person from the time of Adam and Eve until the time of Jesus struggled to get close to God, wanted to get close to God, but failed to actually completely rely on him and completely live, like we said, from the tree of life until Jesus came. And so what God gives us in Jesus is a change of course in history. Like, it changes course for everything in history.
And he alluded to it all throughout the Old Testament. One of the things that blew me away when I first was thinking about God, and before I had even given my life to him, were some facts that were in a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And it was written by a man named Josh McDowell, and a youth minister that I had been talking to gave me a copy of it that I still have to this day. But in that book, he talked about there are over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament that reference the Messiah. So they're specifically talking about Jesus, and Jesus fulfilled them.
Well, the Hebrew word Messiah actually means king.
Yes.
Right? And so they were expecting this God king to come, right?
Yeah, they were.
Okay.
And we'll, I think, talk about that more a little bit later. But the odds of just 8 of those being fulfilled in one person would be like someone taking silver dollars, which I know silver dollar isn't a common coin anymore. But
just a little bit larger than a quarter.
Yeah, larger than a quarter. And taking the whole state of Texas, so it's like 270,000 square miles, and filling it with silver dollars 2 feet deep. So the whole state of Texas is filled 2 feet deep with silver dollars, and I'm talking with my hands on a podcast. And then marking one of those silver dollars with a mark on it, putting it into that 2 feet deep pile across the whole state, stirring it up, and then giving a person who is blindfolded one chance, one try to find that coin that is marked.
Wow.
That's just 8 of the 300. And then it's 10 to the 17th power, 1 in 10 to the 17th power. And then when you...
My brain can't even comprehend
you
that
can't.
kind of math.
When you double that, then it more than doubles it. And if you take our whole solar system and you make a ball out of it with the sun in the very middle, and you go all the way out past Neptune, almost to Pluto, and that's how big this ball is, and you fill it with silver dollars. So it's not just like one plane or one level of silver dollars. It's this whole sphere of silver dollars, and put one in there. And the chances of pulling that one out on the first try would be 16. And there are over 300 of them that were fulfilled by Jesus.
Okay, so 8 prophecies being fulfilled in Jesus would be like covering Texas with 2 feet deep of silver dollars.
Yeah.
16 prophecies being fulfilled in the same person, which were in Jesus, would be like the same silver dollars with the out to almost the ends of our galaxy.
Yeah, and
as a ball.
The person's still blindfolded, and they pull the right one out. Like, that's the odds of 16.
So that's 16 of 300, and yet all 300 were fulfilled in the man we know as Jesus.
Yes.
Wow.
And even to try to describe it, like at the next level, which I think was 48 prophecies out of 300. So still not even near, like, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 1/6.
Like 1/6.
Yeah. He has to use like electrons. So he has to get that tiny to even be able to try to describe someone fulfilling 48 of those. And so it's just completely mind-blowing to think about one man fulfilling all of those, but that's exactly what Jesus did.
Wow. Wow. And that was him coming, like that's the evidence that he was fulfilling all of that as God.
Yeah.
So here's Jesus coming as God, coming as the Messiah. And honestly, in the form of Jesus, in the life of Jesus, what we have is this idea that God said, okay, humanity has struggled to understand what it looks like to live with me. And so what I'm going to do is I am actually going to send a piece of myself down to earth, and I'm going to put skin on. I'm going to put flesh and blood on. And I am actually going to live life as a human with God, showing them how this can work, what my intentions were from the very beginning, what my intentions were in the garden, and also how to live this out like I wanted it to be with Adam and Eve and wanted it to be with every human since that point.
Yes. So it's his plan, his blueprint.
Wow. So he was fully God, and there is no statistical way to actually come against that. In John chapter 1, John actually describes him coming to earth, and he says the Word is what he calls him in John chapter 1, which was that same word, that voice that spoke out creation in Genesis chapter 1, was coming and actually becoming man. He came to dwell, to live among us. And in fact, the word that is used there is the same type of word that is used for the word tabernacle. When something dwells with you, it tabernacles with you, which is neat if you kind of look back and you see how God, when Adam and Eve chose to separate or tear apart heaven and earth, like we talked about in our last discussion, in our last talk last week, God refused to stay away. He said, just because you ripped yourself away from me doesn't mean that I'm ripping myself away from you. And he pursued mankind and humankind by tabernacling with the nation of Israel. And he actually built a place where he could exist with them. But in the person of Jesus, he showed us what his intention was from the beginning, to actually have humankind be his image bearers, but also have him inside of us. And so Jesus actually lived out that humanity in an incredible way. One of the things that we talked about this week in our discussion and in our workbook was just how Jesus was fully human. And I think this is one of those concepts. We talked about concepts every week so far that are like, these are hard things. And if we don't have a category or a folder in our brain for them, sometimes we misplace this. And I think sometimes we look at Jesus very cliche because he is talked about so frequently within our faith. But it's just something so simple that we miss the beauty of it. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
So this idea of living out full humanity, help me understand that.
He was fully human in a way that Adam and Eve were fully human because of the way that he lived out his life here on earth. I think that might be a pretty succinct way to say that, but it's also not an easy concept to think of, like the God of the universe sending down his son and then that person not using the power that he has as being God in order to live out that life here. Does that?
Yeah, I think when we talk about how Jesus was made in the same way, in some ways, that Adam and Eve were made, it was Adam and Eve before they decided to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Right? Mm-hmm. And so Jesus said, hey, we're going to go back to the beginning, back to what God's intention was, and I'm going to live this out. Do you know the story of the Prince and the Pauper? I know it's a children's story that a lot of us are familiar with, or if you've seen the Barbie Princess and the Pauper.
Except me.
Except you. Okay.
I've probably seen it, but I can't recall it right now.
So basically, it's these two identical humans, one that is very poor and one that is the king or the prince. And the prince sees this very poor version of himself, and the prince decides, like, goes to this pauper and says, hey, let's trade places.
Okay.
I want to know what's really going on in my kingdom, and you can live like me for a while.
Yeah, there is a Barbie movie about this. You're right. I do remember that. She's like a famous singer.
Yes, very similar. But the idea is they swap places so that there's this fully king, but living fully as a pauper. And so he, in some ways, that gives us a quick little fairy tale version of what really happened in Jesus. Like, Jesus had every ability that God had, and yet, even though those were his, I heard somebody describe it as he had the God card, like a credit card, put it in his back pocket and never used it.
Yeah, Dan Spader says that, right?
Yeah, Dan Spader. But I think that's really important for us to understand, because I know when I look at Jesus and I look at the miracles that he did in Scripture, and I look at all of the things that he did, whether he was walking on water or raising someone from the dead or calming the sea of the storm or casting out demons, and
those are God-sized things. Yeah,
they're huge.
Yeah.
They're God. Like, I can't picture us doing that. Mm-mm. And yet, what Jesus was showing us is that when we trust God completely, implicitly, without any question, without any reservation, without any hesitancy, that those same God-sized things can be done in full humanity. So I remember Dan Spader again saying in a session that we got to listen to him at a conference one time, and he said something about how, you know, the whole cliche saying, oh, well, I'm only human. I did that because I'm only human. Mm-hmm. And he said, the reality is, no, if we were actually only human, the way God created us to be human, what we would do, we're less than human.
Yeah.
We're not fully human. We don't live out our full humanity.
Well, and when you say completely trust, completely obey, are you saying that there's no room for questioning Jesus?
No. I think that, well, I don't know.
That's just, when you said what you just said a minute ago, you were talking about how if we lived our lives like fully trusting, completely obedient, then does that leave room for any questioning of him?
I think something that hit me recently, we were reading through the book of James, and in James chapter 1, it was talking about sin and how sin ultimately leads to death. But right before it, it was talking about just this idea that Jesus was tempted in every way, just like we are. And yet he didn't sin. And so he had those same temptations. He had the same desires. He had the same probably longings. And yet because he understood the heart of the Father so deeply, because he knew the Father and relied on the Father, relied on the Spirit, he didn't choose to do the things that were tempting him. So it wasn't like he didn't have the same temptations. He just chose that what God knew was better than what he knew every time. And choosing God's perspective every single time over his own. It would be like, I have 5 kids. And my kids love me, every one of them. But there are certain ones of my children that will question my decisions. A lot. Like they will come at me, they will challenge them, they will question them before they will actually just believe me. But I have a couple of my children who have a heart that because they know who I am, that even if I ask them to do something that seems really strange, they will trust what I've said because they trust me.
But in their questions, you also as a parent learn maybe where they're coming from, or maybe where they're off base in something that they're thinking based on what you had previously said to them. And I think the same thing happens in our questioning of God. I'm not saying that it leads to disobedience, but I'm saying it creates a freedom of God being able to show us something that we need to understand differently than maybe we did previously.
Yeah. I think that these are 2 very similar questions from the exact opposite perspective.
Yes.
I think maybe because Jesus pursued the heart of the Father, he never questioned obeying him, even though we know that on the way to the cross, he wanted something different. Like he ultimately said, man, if there's any other way,
right.
Like to the point where he sweat drops of blood, like that's a physical condition that happens under extreme pain, duress of emotion. And so Jesus actually went through that, like wrestling down this idea of what he was about to encounter. And so I don't think that's just this ultimate happy-go-lucky click my heels because God told me to do something idea. I think he definitely said, God, if there is any other way, but ultimately, because you're God, even if there isn't another way, I will do what you've asked me to do. Whereas as a human who is not fully human, Wendy Fitzgerald, Rebecca Lehman.
As my less than human self.
Yes, I think that when we question God, it's not all bad. And I think that what you're saying right now maybe is an important thing for us to really point out, that sometimes we have grown up in an environment in the church where we have been told, don't question God. Don't question what you know about God. And in fact, we've become so knowledge-based with what we've learned about God. Good grief, we go to Sunday school, we go to church, we go to classes to learn about God.
Right.
We go to this Bible study and learn the Greek and the Hebrew, and our whole culture has taught us to have a head knowledge about God where we can answer every single question. And if I can't answer every question, then I better go to somebody that can answer the question, because I want all of my questions to be answered. And I think Jesus lived in such a way that even if he didn't, in his humanity, understand why something had to happen, he trusted God's perspective and would do what God said, even if in his humanity he didn't have a clear answer.
Right.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that.
So,
In my less than humanness, that is not an easy thing to live out day in and day out for myself, but I'm thankful that Jesus could as an example.
yeah. And that's where I think it's really important for us as a blueprint. But I think it's also important for us to state right here, if we can just kind of step back from Jesus for a second and look at ourselves and realize that we are being made into his image and we're not there completely. And when we wrestle with something, or we question something, or we challenge something, or we don't have answers for something, that doesn't necessarily mean we're wrong. In fact, sometimes it might mean we're more right, or closer to where God would want us to be, than we are off base. I think sometimes when we get really full of succinct answers, we become closer to the heart of the Pharisee, like we talked about last week, than if we're questioning God and actually have to walk by faith.
Like the rightness that we talked about before, too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, Jesus being this blueprint, this center of all creation, the wrapping up of the entire cosmos in Jesus, was
The
fully
king.
God.
Yes.
Yes, the king, the beyond statistical ability
Yeah.
could not be denied that he was fully God and also fully human. Mm-hmm. Lived out the way God intends and longs for us to understand him, in such a way that his life impacted others. So he became that place, the temple place, where God and man could coexist in one space, as the very first example of what that looks like. Outside of the walls of a building, for the first time since Adam and Eve. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yes.
So Adam and Eve had that ability to be God and man coexisting. After they tore heaven and earth apart, God and man could only coexist in the place of the temple or the tabernacle.
Or in specific instances where he like poured out his presence on people.
Yes, but not lived inside of them.
Correct.
Until we have Jesus. And Jesus says, hey, this is what it actually looks like to get beyond the walls of a physical building where you have to go to be with God. Instead, God wants to be with you. Mm-hmm. And this is what it will look like for God to be with you. One of the neatest things that we see is this reversal of the idea of infection. And I just want to kind of throw this out there. In the Old Testament, when we see the books of the law given, a lot of the laws that were given were how to keep yourself ceremonially clean so that you could come close to God. Like, how do you take away impurity from yourself so that you can step into a space where God can be close to you? And the reality is, I've heard a lot of people say God can't be close to sin. In fact, we had a conversation with somebody just this last week who that was their big question. If God can't be around sin, then how can I be close to God if I have sin? And I think that that's one place that we struggle to say this exactly right. And I think it's important for us to kind of talk through this just a little bit.
Yeah, and if that were completely true, I don't know that God would be the one in the garden that you see asking Adam and Eve where they were. Like, he was in that, still seeking them out.
Yes. Immediately after they tore apart heaven and earth.
Yeah. So, and you see that in Jesus, in so many examples in the Gospels of doing things that the religious leaders of the day would call ceremonial unclean, against the law. And he caused quite a ruckus in many of those instances.
He was a ruckus rouser.
A ruckus rouser. By drawing into relationship with someone who was deemed a sinner, or even the type of sinner that you should not associate with. But you see him doing that over and over, and it's not him shying away from it. It's him taking who he is to that person, and then that person seeing something different than they've ever seen before in their lives.
He was not afraid to be infected by their sin, but instead knew that his right relationship with God, his righteousness, his right position with the authority of who God was, actually made him the more infectious one. And so his righteousness infected the places that he went rather than the evil infecting him.
And imagine being a person with no hope of ever being in a right place from a religion standpoint, a right standing, like zero hope. And Jesus coming to that person and the realization that it's a possibility, like it could be a thing. Like, when for so long they've believed that it's not even in the cards for them. Like, it's just been something that's been completely given up on. But he doesn't give up on people. And we did watch the series The Chosen, which came out this year. And I love seeing those stories come to life because it shows that hope and that relationship, and what happens when you see someone who has no hope start to have hope because Jesus has entered the picture, and that infection that you're talking about starts to happen.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons that we see in Scripture the stories of the lepers in the way that we do so often. Like, there are a lot of stories of leprosy in Scripture, and leprosy is a physical version, I think, of what happens to us on a spiritual level. Leprosy would actually infect someone and eat away at their humanity, eat away at their skin, make it so that they were separated from society, separated from family, separated from anything that they loved because of the infection, and got to the point where once they had that, it was so hopeless that they would have to cover themselves and stay so far away so no one else would get infected, and scream as people were coming close to them, or as they would walk somewhere, they would have to scream the word unclean, unclean, like to advertise to the world, I am not someone worthy of you coming close to.
Right.
And how many of us live in that type of an environment in our lives spiritually, where the effects of sin have so devoured pieces of our humanity that we feel like we're never worthy to come close to someone who maybe is, well, that good Christian look, you know? Hey, that person has it all together. They love Jesus well. Their family's good. They have this going for them or that going for them, or they would never mess up like I did, or whatever. The effects of sin, those lies of sin that we talked about a couple weeks ago, that devour us and make us feel like we are unworthy. And Jesus came against that hard. And Jesus said, here's the reality. I am not afraid of you as a leper, and I am not afraid of you as a sinner. Because who I am is more infectious in my full humanity for good, for what God intends, than you can be to me. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that we're called to live that same way today. But I think even though it makes sense, it's hard when in our less than humanness, we only see the pain or the suffering or our perspective. Like at the end of 1 Corinthians 13, like the chapter is all about love, but then it talks about, now we only see a poor reflection. Someday we'll see face to face, and now we only know in part. And someday we will know fully, even as we are fully known. And I think that that goes in line with what you're saying in terms of being fully human. Like, we will be fully known and fully human in a way that God intended us always to be, at that point, at that someday point. But right now, in brokenness and pain, I think sometimes it's difficult to see that we are operating from that place that you're describing versus operating from something that is altogether different.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm making sense there.
I think so. And I love that you said face to face. Like, I'm glad you brought in that 1 Corinthians 13 passage, and that idea of then we will see face to face, because that's exactly the ceremony that happened one time a year where the high priest could actually go into the Holy of Holies. It was the deepest part of the temple, was called the Day of Atonement. And it's also at one, the day that things became at one. That they came back together, man and God came, and they were together as one. But the high priest was able to stand face to face with the presence of God that was there on the mercy seat, the mercy of God that was there. And that was the one time of the year. But what Jesus did was he actually changed that and said, we can be face to face with God every day. We can be face to face with this power that overcomes darkness, that overcomes sin, that overcomes leprosy, that overcomes all of that. And so what Adam, the first Adam, actually did was, in his inability to choose to follow God, to choose to trust God, to choose to allow God to stay in the God seat, he, through his life choices, ushered in death. Because if God is life and he chose something other than life, he chose the direction of death. But what Jesus did when God sent Jesus, sometimes he is called the second Adam, because it's like another restart, like a new version.
He flipped it all on its head.
Humanity 2.0.
Yeah.
He flipped it all on its head, and he said, this is really what God intended with the 1.0 version. But God had to allow us in our humanity to work that out and to mess up, and to understand how we couldn't do it without him before we could actually understand the 2.0 version, I think. I'm not even sure that 2.0 is the right way to say it, because I know that
I'm getting a little confused in your numbers there, but I understand what you're saying.
So I know God's intention, and God knew always that Jesus would be, and that he would send Jesus. But I think it's really important for us to understand that what Jesus did was, where Adam, through his life, brought us death, Jesus, through his death, brought us life. And so this is where I kind of want to talk through Jesus and what made him different. Obviously, everything we've talked about so far is how he lived out his life differently. He didn't fall for the same lies of the enemy. He chose to trust God even when it was difficult to make that decision. Even to the point of being wrongly accused, which, man, when I'm wrongly accused for something, the first thing I want to do is fight back and make sure that that person knows that that's not true. But Jesus allowed himself to be wrongly accused and to take the punishment of that accusation onto himself, because that same idea of infecting with goodness the things that were evil, he believed that so deeply that he knew that on the cross, when all of that evil was actually heaped on him, that as he absorbed it into himself, that was the only way for that evil to actually stop. I think that's something that is hard to grasp in our empire society of today.
I think we grasp it in terms of dying on Good Friday and raising on Easter. But I do think it's hard to internalize what that really means and how that affects everything.
What do you mean?
I read a book called Finding God in the Ruins, and there was a passage in it that talked about Jesus in a way that I hadn't heard previously, but I had, and it's the same concept that we're talking about. Like, he died for all of the evil, all of the sins of all mankind. Like, that was part of, or not part, but wholly, the purpose of his death. And so he's taking all of that on. And I get that from my own personal salvation perspective.
I think we stop at the personal salvation side of it, though.
And we do, because then when I'm suffering from the sin of someone else, or suffering because of some terrible thing that's happened in the world, some act of God, I think is what we actually call that category of event, in a lot of contracts and things that I've seen that are, outside the hands of anything that we can control, which is interesting in this whole conversation, but probably a totally different discussion.
No, I think it's actually a really good discussion, and I think we should go down there real quick because I think you're right. I think we sometimes put Jesus on the cross as the payment for our sin, not the payment of our sin. And I think that's like saying that a big hurricane is an act of God, or a tsunami is an act of God. Like something outside of our hands is an act of God, where the reality is it's the brokenness of our world that has been there since the ripping apart of heaven and earth that has caused so many of those things to be part of our world today. And it's not that we have this angry God who is requiring a payment for all of the things we've done wrong, but instead it is sin that causes the consequences. It is our pursuit of the opposite of God that unleashes that evil that hurts us into the world. And God instead has been offering the entire time a cure for the illness that is wreaking havoc on us. And sin is that illness that is actually wreaking havoc on our whole world. And you think back to your very first verse that you read about Jesus being the entire blueprint of the cosmos. He's not just coming to make sure that I make it to heaven. He's coming to restore God's entire creation.
And I get that, and I understand it. I understand what you're saying, but there's also this aspect of when I am hurting or I am suffering, or someone that I dearly love is suffering and it seems so pointless and I don't understand it. And the questions that start to come with that are questions like, if God cared about us, if Jesus cared about me, then why would this be allowed? Like, where is he in that suffering? And that's what this book that I was reading spoke to. And I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from it, because I think that this perspective has changed how I see suffering in my own life and how I view it completely, honestly, in those questions of where Jesus is. And so this is in the middle of a chapter, but it says, God watches us squirm. I don't know if I will ever get used to it. I think of the atrocities of this world, such as 10-year-old Indian girls being sexually violated time and time again in the brothels of Mumbai, and I know God sees it happen, but also that he doesn't intervene in the way that I would, that any of us would. When I sent God away, I wanted to know what was happening in the heavenly realms when life was brutalizing his children. I pictured God in Indian brothels, staring on. I imagined him leaning against the laundry machine in my basement, seeing all of it. In brothels and basements, I knew he was there, but what was he doing if not intervening? While writing this book, I sent an earlier portion of the manuscript to a good friend of mine. In chapter 5, I had written this statement. He participated in their horrors by being present. This is what my friend sent back to me. Where is God? He is hanging there on the gallows. He's not just in the brothel with the girl being violated. He is being violated. He is being violated. I let that thought sink in, and for the first time in my life, the crucified God looked different to me. He wasn't watching, he was receiving. Before this moment, I had compassion for God only on the Friday he was executed. That was the day his human rights were violated. But now I was faced with the idea of his crucifixion being stretched out until the end of time. That in every abysmal crime against us, every suicide, every abuse, every murder, rape, and addiction, God himself was being violated. God wasn't staring on in the brothels of Mumbai. He was stuck on a dirty floor with a pedophile on top of him. And he wasn't leaning against the laundry machine in my basement. He was being pierced, crushed, bruised, and wounded so eventually I could be healed. It happened to him every time it happened to me. It was him, the same as it was me.
Wow.
And so when you think about Jesus absorbing all of that on the cross for all of mankind, for all of time, that passage in that book gave meaning to that in a way that I don't think that I understood prior to reading that.
Gave meaning to him on the cross.
Yeah.
Gave meaning to him absorbing evil. Gave meaning to...
Beyond just my own evil.
Yeah.
But all evil.
It's often easy to understand the answer of Jesus came to earth. Jesus put on human flesh. Jesus showed us the blueprint of life. But to actually understand that in obeying the Father completely, in allowing the power of God's Spirit to fill him, the way that he reversed the curse of sin and death wasn't a one and done thing.
Right.
It was I'm living this out, and at every time that I can, where evil is wreaking havoc against my beautiful creation, I will absorb that evil into me. And in doing so, put it out. In doing so, extinguish the fiery arrows of the evil one. Stop the attack in some ways by enduring the attack. But it doesn't mean that evil has been stopped on this earth. So to think of Jesus until he returns, still enduring every pain, every hurt, every suffering that we go through with us, as a way for healing to happen in that place, is a huge perspective change.
I think Paul understood that really well. If you read in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, it talks about, I think when they were trying to go into Asia and like the things that happened to them and how they even thought that they were like despairing, I think, unto death is what it says in the text. And
is that wishing that they could die?
I think so, yeah. Like
I think so too.
Like the despair was so great and so overwhelming that death would have been a blessing. And in that, though, it talks about how they were delivered and they will be delivered, and then they are continuing to be delivered. And so there's like all three tenses, like a present, past, and a future tense of this deliverance that God is still doing and still rescuing today. And then the next part is pretty cool there, because it talks about how he's asking them to pray, because by praying they're joining in and able to be part of God's deliverance in that way. And I think that deliverance is the purpose of the blueprint, and that ability to live in a way that affects others or infects others, I guess, as you were saying earlier, would be appropriate. With that is something that we need as much today as we did then.
Yeah. I think Jesus showed us what it looks like for perfect love to really cast out all fear, that he was not afraid of the things that humanity had become afraid of. He wasn't afraid to get messy. He wasn't afraid of anyone's messiness. And he wasn't afraid of the pain and the hurt that would come with loving well. Instead, that was exactly the place that he knew life would come from. So this week, as you wrestle down this idea of Jesus being the blueprint for all creation, and you read through different scripture passages and you really ponder the idea of Jesus as not only all God, but as full humanity, living out the fullness of what God intended you to actually live out as well. I guess I would really encourage you to confront your version or vision or understanding of Jesus that's in your head so far. That flannel graph Jesus maybe that we have in our vision, or that picture of Jesus in the white robe and the blue sash and the sandals and walking on water, or whatever it is that you see when you see the picture of Jesus. But actually ask God to remove that partial vision, maybe, of what we have inside of our lives of what Jesus really is and who he was, so that we can understand the blueprint that he called us to be. Jesus was the temple. He was the place where God and man could coexist. He was the temple priest. He connected his disciples to God the Father. He said to his disciples often, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So he was that connecting point. But more than anything, what we've talked about today is he was the temple sacrifice. He was willing to say that if evil is going to be absorbed, then that means instead of going out and in all power from an empire perspective, annihilating it, instead, what I will do is all power from a kingdom perspective, absorb it, and therefore allow the infection of true godliness, righteousness, and humanity to take its place.
So how do we then sacrifice and absorb in that same way?
Yeah. That's the question of the week. And we are excited for you to wrestle that down and to hear how maybe God confronts your preconceived notion of Jesus. Let him do it this week.
Thanks for joining us. We know your time is valuable and pray that you were both encouraged and challenged by this week's discussion. If you're interested in hosting an If Then Move conference, or if you'd like to chat about one of the topics discussed in this session, reach out to us on social media at If Then Move, or through our website, ifthenmove.com. We'd love to hear from you.